Hey everyone, this is Lizzie Karen, and welcome to my channel on Atlantis. In case you're new to my channel, I will just give you a quick overview of what it's all about. I dream about a past life that started about 36,000 years ago, until the time that I actually died in my dream, and that was in ancient Egypt. It is quite possible I'm completely bonkers, but even if I am, at least you might find my dreams intriguing. I've had the dreams all my life, and I document all the ones I can remember, which is most of them, thank goodness. The place in my dreams was mainly of Tantal, and this place seems to me to be what we call Atlantis. A rose by any other name, eh? In my dream regressions, I lived for thousands of years thanks to Atlantean longevity technology. In this episode, I'm going to cover fashion of the ancients in Atlantis. So here we go, fashion. I was asked a while ago about the fashion in Atlantis, but it's such a wide and complicated topic to cover. And this is for several reasons. The first reason is the active time frame in my dream regressions for Atlantis was over 24,000 years. So that's just a long, long time to be covering fashions, how they evolved and how they changed over that time frame. Number two, also, there were different sets of rulers, 3 of them, and each of these 3 eras brought different cultural norms, different societal levels, and different fashion technologies. Point 3, Atlantis, as we know it today, was not just one location. The cultural center was a place called Tantal, but there were 9 other locations around the world. The various locations were in different temperate zones, from a frozen wasteland to a tropical paradise. And over the period of 24,000 years, there was also significant changes in the climate. So fashion had to adapt to that as well. And my last point is that I actually left Tantal during the reign of the second leader. So for the reasons that I've just indicated, plus the fact that it would require rather a large book to cover in detail all the aspects of the fashion that I've actually seen in my dream regressions, I shall therefore limit my description of fashion to a specific period in time, and that's the time period I know the best, the era of Uran. And this actually covers more than 9,000 years, so that's still an awful lot to cover. So it'll be at a reasonably high level. I'm going to address fashion in the city of Tantal, and not the other 9 locations, although there is going to be obviously some overlap. Before my people moved to the new location, the new city of Tantal, the fashions were, homemade. They were made from scratch, so the fabric was a bit coarse. The area was colder than Tantal, so the fabric had to be warmer and heavier. There were 2 main parts to the outfit: a longish skirt that fitted under the breasts for women and at the waist for men. They were otherwise the same fabric, the same style, everything. The nearest I can compare them to is a kilt. And this was combined with a cape, either a round one or square, more like a poncho. And they were usually very colourful, and the front of the cape had like a folded piece that was stitched through, and a string or a belt could be put through it in order to secure the front of the cape so it didn't get in the way when we were working. The way we dressed before moving to Tantal was very standardized. Everybody dressed the same sort of way. It was very similar for men and women, with the differences mainly being in the jewellery. This trend further continued once we were in Tantal, with little to no difference in the actual clothing, but then also little to no difference in the jewellery. The way a person dressed was essentially the same for males and females, but it was the only aspect of the original fashion style that really stuck. Once we moved to Tantal, the fashions started to change. So fashion developed based on several factors. Technology, obviously, the change in the culture, and one of the biggest things was self-identity. And I'll cover each of these factors that were predominant for the changes in fashion. So let's start with the impact of technology. I'm going to talk about the cape first of all, because the cape did carry it with us from the previous lifestyle that we'd had before we became super duper civilized. And it evolved, and it continued to be a key part of the fashion, not just because we liked it, but also because it was part of our technology. And for that reason, capes literally never went out of fashion because they were fundamental to our personal transportation. They formed part of the gliding device for personal flight, short distances only. The cape, combined with buoyancy rods, enabled everyone to simply set the rods to a certain level, enabling us to go up in the air, and then once the desired height was reached, the rods would be set to a lower level of buoyancy to enable a gentle gliding descending, which together with the cape meant the person could just glide to the location they wished to travel to. It was very simple, and you just went upwards, you reduced your buoyancy, you would glide back down, and you'd just use the cape, which was attached at the shoulders and the wrists, for direction, and it was a very pleasurable experience. So just to clarify, the cape fastened across the top of the arms and the wrists to metal bands, usually gold, that looked like normal jewellery. And once attached, the cape fitted very snugly around the shoulders. And there were loops on the lower part of the longer capes, which would enable you to step backwards into the loops, and the legs would be secured with the cape. Now, the cape came in different styles and designs, but a feather pattern, like wings, was very, very popular. Then there were the rods for buoyancy, and they looked like a corset made up of sausages in the early days. But as the technology improved, it became incorporated into the very fabric of our clothing. The winged gods of Egypt are actually a perfect example, well, almost perfect example, of the type of attire that the capes in fact were. Length was about the same as this statue drawing of a statue. Sometimes they were a lot longer than this. You will see that from the end of the hands, the cloak actually continues to stick out. That is because there were rods in there as well, which enabled the cloak to have that extra stability. They were attached by the bands that you can see in the arrows on both wrists and both arms. Some were further attached at the legs, as I've already mentioned, and others were attached down the backbone so that it gave the extra stability. Now onto the subject of fabric. Because of the advances in technology, over time a wide range of fabrics were developed, and that increased the options for fashion in general. So what was actually worn under the cape changed a lot over the years. For a long time, the simplicity and chicness were really it when it came to fashion. The climate was temperate, so people wore a very lightweight, fine tunic-style item that slipped on over the head, looked nice, and was cool. People had preferences regarding colour, length, and the jewellery they wore with it, but essentially, it was just a really simple item of clothing. And that general style lasted for at least 1,000 years. But slowly things started to change due to a desire for individuality. And I'll discuss that next. The biggest impact on fashion came with the concept of self-identity. By that I mean individuality, gender identification, themes, belonging to groups. This is really the biggest aspect of fashion and how it changed in Atlantis. Things in fashion started to change when people were trying to define their individuality. There were some people who wanted to move away from the androgynous look and create an image with a strong masculine or feminine bent to it. Firstly, it's important to note that culturally, a female was no different to a male in almost every way. So even though the main leaders of each era were men, it was not from a lack of equality and much more to do with the fact that women just didn't want the job. There were many women in roles of leadership, especially under the first two leaders, but not so much with the third leader. So even with fashions that started to define masculinity or femininity, the fascinating part of the fashion was that you were not required to be female to adopt the feminine fashion or male to adopt the masculine one. It was purely a matter of preference and the identity you had for yourself. This change in fashion just added to the spectrum. It didn't replace the androgynous look that had worked so well for so long. It just added to it, so it was another option for people. As people moved further towards the idea that fashion could be a big part of their identity, other fashion groups started to form. And these groups were not just trends. The best way I could describe it is they were like a theme. A person might adopt a theme and stick with it. Or they might try a theme for a while and then move on to another theme. Either way, it was not important. But what did tend to happen was that communities started to form within the groups of a particular theme. Before describing some of these fashion lifestyle themes, I'll attempt to put it into the perspective of today, just so that you might understand what I'm trying to say. So imagine if there was a group of people, which may even be true, that 100% of their time they dressed as a Disney character, or even maybe a steampunker, or in anime, or maybe from the Edwardian era. They wear it at home, they go to work in it, they go to parties in it, they even go to life events like weddings in it. They literally wear it everywhere. Then imagine those people who like to dress this one particular way start to move into one particular area of the city. And so a city might then start having something like a steampunk district or an Edwardian district. That is what the theme fashion did in Atlantis. But the themes weren't like anything we have today. But because it's so difficult to explain, that's why I've used the essence of what a theme is today. I'll list out a few of the groups that are easy to explain, But there were hundreds, if not thousands, of groups over the time frame in which I lived in Atlantis, or should I say Tantal? So here's the list. So primitives, that's just copying what a specific group of primitive people were actually wearing. They had plenty of primitive cultures to choose from, so that made it a little bit more interesting. Then there were ones that were just simply colour-based. So that meant wearing everything purple. Purple clothes, purple homes, purple skin. Yes, you heard that right, purple skin. Purple food, purple fingernails, and of course, anything purple in fashion. So it was, to them, it was like a purple world. And that was their theme, the colour purple, or whatever colour it was that they chose, yellow or whatever. Then there's the era-based fashion. So that's things like wearing and living like a specific time period. For example, the time before Tantal City, before everybody moved to Tantal. That was a big favourite, especially since we had regular celebrations regarding the founding of Tantal, and we all dressed and acted like the time before Tantal. Anyway, it was actually before we had the longevity drug, so we didn't have old people now, but we did have them then. So some people even would dress up and do makeup to make them look like an old person. And then there were the animal-based themes. So I'm sure you can kind of imagine the amazing varieties that there could have been on this sort of theme or group. But the interesting thing about this fashion is how it got started. There was a game that was so popular that some people, well, quite a few people, were fanatical. That's the word I'm looking for, fanatical at times. It was called the Game of Herds. The way it worked was that players had a collection of counters that were animal counters to play with. And they had a set which were of a particular type of animal. For example, they might have a collection of ostriches, or crocodiles, or cats, or dogs, or eagles. You get the idea. But each of the counters were individually crafted, and so each counter had like a personality, like it wasn't the same cat over and over. It was, cats in different poses with different fur and things like that. So it was a set of cats, but they weren't the same cats. The Game of Herds is something that had a very strong impact on the culture of Tantal. And it's also something I've had many, many dreams about. And I could easily describe the game in great detail. So if anyone is interested, I could do an episode on it eventually. Anyway, the game was the motivation for this animal fashion trend. Another trend was what we might call fantasy, for lack of a better word. So it covered like all kinds of different ways of dressing. But because I can't explain some of the background, some of the stories, some of the things that created these fantasies, it's really hard to explain it all. For example, there was a fashion that was all about feathers. People would spend hours, if not days, going to exotic locations to collect feathers. They only ever used feathers that they collected, that birds had dropped. Feathers were then made into some exquisite outfits. And the outfits were just fantasy. There wasn't really an explanation about it. It was just fantasy. Like another example, some people like to dress like a cloud. I know that sounds ridiculous, but just think white and fluffy. It's a bit silly, but to some people, well, they thought it was fun. After dreams like that, I would think to myself, this is just so ridiculous. How can anyone have dreams like this? I must be either bonkers or I have one hell of an imagination, because this is just really out there. But then other times I've thought to myself, how could anybody imagine something as left field as that? You can't just come up with something so ridiculous. Sometimes if it's just so weird that it just defies explanation. I admit, though, that it has caused me to doubt myself on occasions. Maybe fashion isn't supposed to be sensible or logical. Maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe it's just fun. I don't know. But most importantly, I think it's about expressing one's identity. And maybe the cloud thing or the feathers thing or whatever had a critical part in making people feel like they belonged, like they were part of a group, or that it expressed who they were. Once part of a group, or if you had selected a theme for your clothes, you'd stick with it. You'd wear it every day, no matter what you were doing. It became part of who you were. And so as such, a person would wear those same clothes to work as they would to a party. And, well, in a nice way, it meant they were always dressed up. There wasn't really a difference between occasions, except in certain circumstances, like, for example, if you were celebrating something that required different attire, like the founding of Tantal celebration. And also if you were going into an area where the temperature may have been different, you could also require to have something different in your attire. If you were in specific roles also that may need a different type of clothing. For example, a jockey would wear a specific type of clothes, as would law enforcement. They had their own style about them. Well, this seems to have been going on for a while, this episode, so I'm going to call it a day. I won't go into jewellery, the bands, the collars, watches, or even bags at this point. I think they are big enough to have their own separate episode. In fact, bags, the bags of the gods, could be a big episode in its own right. And that's only if anyone's interested in me talking about that sort of thing. Anyway, that's it for fashion. And I will catch you all next time.